I often wonder what this proclamation of Jesus, how it must have sounded to his Jewish audience in that first century world of ancient Palestine. They had come to know God in a very specific and special way. They had come to know God through the great event of their history, the Exodus, where God had heard the cries of the oppressed in slavery and had worked to liberate and set them free. They had come to know God at Sinai, where God, through the prophet Moses, speaks a vision of how they are to be a people in the world, shaped and formed by God and God alone. No pope, no potentate, no president, no pharaoh would shape their life. Only God, God who had brought them up out of slavery, leading them into the land of freedom. They had come to know God through the dark days of exile, where after the glorious kingdoms of David and Solomon, everything seemed to be destroyed and dashed. That's what the prophet Isaiah hints at today. In that place of darkness, where it didn't seem as if they had a future anymore. It didn't seem that all of the promises were to ever be fulfilled. They had begun to doubt, had begun to question, had begun to wonder if they should continue believing in God. The prophet, the priest of the temple, had told them, well, God is like this, and as the temple is rebuilt at the end of exile, and then as the glorious temple of Herod the Great is being built, the priest said, this is how it is to be. You are to be clean and pure, and that access to the prayer house of God is restricted and limited to only those who live the right way of life, who are of a certain kind of people, that the dirty and the unclean and those at the edges and foreigners, for God's sake, are excluded and prohibited. I say this as Jesus at one instance turns the money changers' tables over. The phrase that is applied to that action is, you have turned this house of God into a den of thieves and murderers. It is to be open as a house for all peoples. And there again is that vision of God liberating and setting free, of shaping and forming not just the religious and spiritual life of the people, but the political, the economic, and the social life of the people. Read the commandments, and you will see they are not just spiritual entities. They are about a political life, where God defines the values of the people, where the economics are never about taking and hoarding and giving more to the powerful and the rich and the mighty, but always distributing them equally and fairly across all the peoples and strata of the society. So when Jesus says, God is here, the reign of God begins now, I wonder what his audience must have thought about God and what they thought about this announcement. God had been with them. How is it that now Jesus is saying, God is here now in a powerful way in your midst? What they must have thought about. It is clear that this is a statement not just of spiritual reality, but a statement of fact. And since we have the benefit of the story, a whole story as the Gospels tell us, and the people then didn't have that, we can see now what Jesus is implying. That God is about to work in specific ways, not for the high and the mighty and the powerful, but in ways for the poor and the lowly and the excluded ones. That the vision that Jesus announces is as God had always acted for the people, to make whole, to lift up, to heal, to include rather than exclude. That God was always going to work for those at the edges and the margins, who indeed were the victims of harsh ritual laws of purity, who were the victims of the being sharecroppers as they were, being victims of the corporate bankers in Jerusalem or Rome for that matter, that God was going to work for those who had been excluded, marginated, who had been indeed oppressed by harsh laws and rules that restricted access, if you will, to what they needed to live on and survive, that had limited their access in a way to God. So as a part of this vision, we have to again understand that Jesus isn't just talking about God, but Jesus is talking about the way the world could look like and be if indeed it would let God shape and form it. But it wasn't just about God's actions. It was going to be about the way that the people in Jesus' audience, as much as us 2,000 plus years later, the way that we participate in that action of God's liberation, creation, making whole, lifting up, setting free, the way that we, the so-called disciples of Jesus, the followers of Jesus, are going to shape a world according to that vision. That's the idea. It's not just God acting, but it is the way that we become co-creators, participants, actors with God to shape a world that looks very different, at least in the first century, a world that would look very different from the way Rome had decided it should be. The way that the priest in the temple in Jerusalem had decided it should be. This is a vision of a world that is fully inclusive, a world that respects the dignity and integrity of every person. And if you think I'm off on this, just consider again the actions and behavior of Jesus. He was not afraid to go into the house of Peter's mother-in-law, as we will hear in a minute, and touch her, entering into her room of illness and disease, even encountering her as a woman, that Jesus enters that world with full respect, with absolute awareness of the dignity of this woman that nobody else could take the time to consider. That when Jesus reaches for her and lifts her up, that's how God works, to recognize, to restore, to hold with honor and reverence the dignity of this one person who nobody was going to take the time of day for. But Jesus did. God would. And so the world created by this vision of Jesus is to do and be exactly in that way. You see, this is why always the invitation is revolutionary, if you will. This statement in Mark's Gospel is absolutely radical, if you want to consider it. Yes, in a revolutionary way. Radical here meaning at the root, at the heart, at the foundation, at the core of who not only each individual is, but at the heart, at the root of the foundation of the community that is reflective of this vision of God's reign. But you see, Jesus, knowing human life, human community, extends one further invitation. And while the translation is really maybe not accurate or adequate, maybe that's a better way to say it, that the invitation is turn from where you had been, turn away from a worldview that you've been committed to, turn away, divest yourself, disengage, and separate yourself from a world that has been, and turn toward this world vision, this new way of being that God is inviting you to. That's what the idea of repent, and in Greek the word, of course, is metanoia. Change every part of who you are. Change your values, change your commitment, change your association, change everything that has defined your life before this moment, and now reshape your life, your values, your principles, your commitment, your social organization, your economic choices and decisions, so that they are now reflective of who God is and what God intends the world to be about. So that as you walk along thinking discrimination, prejudice, hate, violence is the norm, and so that's how it is, and you encounter God, you are to turn your back on that way of thinking, living, believing, and now embrace fully this vision of God and God's reign. It's clear that Jesus is intending his audience, even in the first century, as much as we who still have the privilege of hearing these words 2,000 plus years later, that the intent is that we cannot ever think that disciples and followers of Jesus, or that the church, for that matter, can ever participate in something that is contrary to the will and the purpose and the intent of God. 4+ years ago, when we began the process of becoming an open and affirming congregation, we met with resistance. And we lost several members who, even if they had no problem with gay or lesbian people, just could not imagine that as a church community we would be committed to doing more than just saying we're a welcoming community, but that we really were going to commit to being an open and affirming community. It's sort of like the old phrase, I don't mind if my daughter has a friend who's black or gay or Hispanic, but just don't marry them. No, if we're a community that says we have this vision of God and that means being inclusive, then it has to mean that we marry them in a sense, not literally, but that we welcome into membership all those who might be labeled as different, who because of the society and even this community of Sun Lakes that we live in, who might not be so welcome to join the golf club or to be in membership. Just look at how racially diverse we are here in Sun Lakes. And it might give you an idea of just how welcoming we are in Sun Lakes. It's okay for our gardeners to be Mexican, but maybe not to live in our neighborhood. See how that works? So when we took that step to become an open and affirming congregation, I hope it was more than just words, or that we did it because Pastor Vernon wanted it. I hope it was more than that. And you see in this grand vision of Jesus, and notice that after this announcement, he indeed calls disciples. And what's interesting in the Gospel of Mark, that doesn't always get translated into English, that it says, and immediately he went and did this, and immediately he did this, and immediately he did this, and immediately he did that. English doesn't like the repetition. You say it once, okay, I got it, but to keep repeating it seems a bit overstating it. But in the intent or the vision of Mark's Gospel, it says that this is something urgently needed, that it's something urgently needing our attention. That if you have to keep repeating it, it says if we wait much longer, it might pass us by. And so there's a sense of urgency and immediacy, not only in the response that is required to this message, but in the message itself. And I dare think that any of us don't even imagine that this message is still as urgently and as immediately needed as now, when it becomes so easy to, under the guise of law, say that it's okay to discriminate, that it's okay to be prejudiced, and that we can even stand behind religious freedom and say that it is my religious freedom to discriminate and prejudice. I don't know where that is in the Bible. Because it's not mine. So, when 4 years ago we became an open and affirming congregation, what we have to make sure that we clearly understand is that at its heart means that we have absolute respect for the dignity and integrity of every member in this congregation. That our quickness to gossip and our quickness to say sharp things and our quickness to can indeed be taken as a denigration of that dignity or a lack of respect for the person. We must be careful with our words. And while we don't intend them to hurt, they can indeed hurt. A friend of mine, I think I told that story, who I took him in, homeless in a sense. I told him, I'm sorry, we don't allow language. I don't allow language that hurts other people. And I had to ask him to leave. And while I would hope we would never ask anyone to leave this congregation, people have chosen to leave because they didn't feel welcome or respected. So it says we still have a lot of work to do. 4 years ago, we all said yes to our covenant as open and affirming. That even for us old people, it still means a change of heart and a reconsideration of the values and commitments we make. Because that's what it means to be open and affirming, accepting, with absolute respect for the dignity and integrity of every person. And that's what it means to be followers and disciples of Jesus in the reign of God. If any place in some ways has to be a place where that vision is given, then let it be here. Because it has to start somewhere. And it has started here. Let it change, not just us, but let it change some lengths as well.